Good morning, students. Recall that last week we treated chapter 7 with the title Nigeria and the Transatlantic Slave Trade. In that chapter 7, we treated the origin of the slave trade, the organization, the effect of the slave trade, and how Britain, in her wisdom, intervened and abolished slave trade in British soil in 1807. And in 1833, Britain abolished slave trade in all British Empire. Surprisingly, Britain that abolished slave trade in 1833 discovered that the slave trade was still surging. People, other European nations were still involved in this obnoxious trade called slave trade. So many missionaries, so many explorers, so many traders, European traders who were in Nigeria, advised the British government that for the trade in human beings to stop, they must attack it from its source, that is the interior, because they believed that most of those trades that were coming to the coastal areas were coming from the interior part of Nigeria, the hinterland. Therefore, to get to the hinterland, the River Niger must be explored. In 1788, British African Association took the right decision by saying this river that has been a mystery, that people do not know its source, the rising and the termination. They wanted to explore it. They wanted to know the direction of its flows. So between 1788, when British Association was formed, and 1793, BAA sent 3 different explorers. 1, 2 followed North Africa, and nothing was heard from them. The 3rd, which was led by Captain Daniel Houghton, followed Gambia. In 1793, the report of Houghton proved that the River Niger flowed to the east, but it was a theory. Nobody has actually known whether the River Niger flowed to the east or west, and this thing led to different theories, different speculations. Some say that the River Niger flowed to the west, some say that it flowed to the east, some say that the River Niger is as the same as the River Nile. It was this mystery associated with the River Niger that made British government and British Association of Nigeria to be interested in sending explorers to Africa. Today, we are going to look at the objective of this chapter 8, and we say that at the end of today's lesson, our students should be able, 1, to account for the motives behind the exploration of the Niger. Yes, before Britain or other European nations must be interested in exploring the West African interior, there must be reasons. Our students should also know the identities of those British and other European explorers that participated in exploring the River Niger. We will also examine the result of the exploration of the West African interior. We look at the motives for the 18th and 19th centuries exploration. We say here that a number of considerations motivated the Europeans, that is British, to explore the West African interior. One is there was a lot of curiosity in Europe about West Africa, and this curiosity was stimulated by the spirit of scientific inquiry that was growing in that period. At the center of this curiosity was the River Niger, whose source and direction had been an object of much controversy. Various views about the River Niger were that it flowed eastwards, it flowed westward into Senegal or the Gambia, it flowed across the Sudan into the upper waters of the Nile, it drains into Lake Chad, and that it was a tributary of the Congo. So these conflicting theories about the River Niger makes it appealing for Britain to send explorers. Number two, the desire to expand British trade overseas was an important motivating factor too for the exploration. The mass production of goods brought about by the Industrial Revolution created a surplus of goods begging for markets where they could be sold. Thirdly, there was a great desire by Britain to stamp out the slave trade. As we said in the introduction, that when Britain abolished slave trade in British soil in 1807 and in 1833 they abolished it in British empires, yet the trade in slaves continued. So the British government wanted to put a final stop to this trade in human beings. And finally, the missionary spirit, that is the desire to spread Christianity, was one of the important reasons for the exploration. Missionaries sometimes accompanied explorers with the aim of preaching the Christian religion among the people of the areas explored. I'll talk about the British exploration. We look at the background first. We had already said that the formation of British African Association in 1788 was the first signal that indicated that Britain was interested in the exploration of West African interior, and they sent terrain explorers between 1788, when the association was formed, and 1793. The first two explorers passed through North Africa and nothing was heard from them. The last explorer that started in 1791 was led by Major Houghton. Houghton started from Batos, followed the course of the Gambia, and eventually did not get beyond the kingdom of Bambok. Houghton was, however, able to send back sufficient information which suggested that the Niger might flow to the east. We now look at Mungo Park's expedition. Mungo Park was a young Scottish medical doctor who was employed by the British African Association to explore the African interior with a view to ascertaining the cause and, if possible, the source and mouth of the River Niger. He made two expeditions. The first one started in 1795 and took him to Gambia and Segu. Park's daring was extreme. His determination and sense of mission unequaled. Robbed of his belongings, often imprisoned, weakened by fever and hunger, he still pushed ahead. At last, his perseverance was rewarded when, on July 21st, 1796, he reached the Niger at Segu. Describing the event, let's look at the slide and see what Mungo Park wrote. He said, "As we rode together through some marshy ground, where as I was anxiously looking around for the river, one of them called out," that is one of his servant, black African servant, "Geo a feeling," meaning see the water. And looking forward, I saw with infinite pleasure the great object of my mission, the long sought for majestic Niger, glittering to the morning sun, as wide as the thermals at Westminster, and flowing to the eastward. I hastened to the brink, and having drunk the water, lifted up my fervent thanks in prayer to the great ruler of all things, for having thus far crowned my endeavors with success. This was the greatest endeavor any explorer would have made. So Pratt did not get to Sego, and he went back to Britain. When he went to England, the result of his exploration wakened and aroused great interest in the River Niger, to the extent that 10 years after, in 1805, Pratt was asked again to go back to the river. But unfortunately, the 44 members that left Britain to explore the River Niger, none of them came back. So there were other explorers that decided to go and continue from where Mungo Park stopped. And one of them was Dr. Walter Oldby, who Clapton, Army Lieutenant Denham, and a carpenter named William Hillman. They started in Tripoli in 1822, crossed the Sahara, and reached Lake Chad in 1823. They later explored Borno, where they were all received by El Kanami, and they also visited Kano, where Odme died. After exploring Sokoto, Clapton and Denham returned to England through Tripoli in 1825. Remember that the mystery surrounding the River Niger has not been found. In the later part of 1825, the British government sent out Clapton again to try to discover where the Niger flowed into the sea. By this time in Britain, there were a widely held belief that many rivers around Akassa, Bonny, and Brass were the distributors or outlets of the River Niger, but nobody had proved this belief. He was also to try to establish friendly relationship. The team landed at Badagry in 1825, from where they started the journey to the interior with a trader named Houston, whom the team had earlier met at Port Novo as a guide. Within 7 weeks of the journey through Yoruba land, all members of the team, except Clapton and Landa, had died of malaria and dysentery. They were well received by rulers and people of these places, except Kano and Sokoto, whose rulers were engaged in war with Borno and so had no time to be of help to them. Clapton died in Sokoto, and Landa went back to Badagry in England in 1828 with Clapton's journal. This disaster, remember that with Clapton and his team were 49 that left Britain. Out of those 49, all of them had already died of either malaria or dysentery, or scurvy. It was only Richard Landa, who was Clapton's servant, that was the only one left. Because of the disaster that occurred, out of the 49 persons that left England, only one came back. British government was no longer interested in sending more explorers, but Richard Landa continued to persuade the British government to allow him and his younger brother John to return back. Finally, British government approved his request. By December 1829, Richard has succeeded in persuading the government to allow him and his brother to continue the exploration of the Niger. The two brothers, Richard and John Landa, reached Badagry on March 22nd, 1830, and journeying by the same route as Richard had done before, reached the Niger at Busa in July. On October 25th, they got to the confluence of the Niger and the Benue, and a month later, the explorers were in the delta area of the Niger, satisfied that the river emptied itself into the Atlantic. The mouth of the Niger, with its several creeks, was destined to be important in the European commercial activities in Africa. By the time the Lander brothers concluded their journey, it had been the center of the slave trade, and soon it was become the hub of a rapidly expanding palm oil trade. Now, we will look at the difficulties encountered by these Europeans. Remember, Mungo Park, who made a daring step into discovering the mystery associated with the River Niger, had his last chance in 1805, and 25 years later, 1830, Richard Landers and John Landers solved the mysteries associated with the River Niger by finding the source or the mouth, the flow, and the termination of the Niger River. They discovered that the Niger River flows and terminates at the Atlantic Ocean. We now look at the difficulties that many European explorers encountered while they were exploring the River Niger. The first one, there was the problem of language. The explorers were people of different nationalities, such as England, Scotland, Germany, and France. Secondly, adequate means of transport, both for the explorers and their baggage, could not be got. Footpaths through the forest, caravan routes in the desert, and later the uncharted rivers were the main highways. Point number 3. The tropical climate caused some setback on the activities of the explorers. This was especially true in earlier exploration with little knowledge of African climate available. 4. The greatest difficulty and by far the greatest enemies of the explorers were tropical diseases, especially dysentery, malaria, and scurvy. The 5th point, the explorers had the difficulty of shortage of funds and provisions. This was largely as a result of underestimation of their needs as well as unforeseen circumstances. And finally, the explorers had to contend with the hostility of some Nigerians. Such hostility was not without a cause, because Nigerians have been known to be very friendly and cooperative with strangers. We now look at the result of the exploration of the West African interior, and one of the results is the exploration solved the mystery that had earlier surrounded the River Niger, thereby bringing to an end all the speculations about its source and cause. This is because the source, cause, and mouth of the river were thoroughly explored and the coast carefully charted. Furthermore, the exploration afforded Europeans the opportunity of getting first-hand information about West African interior. Secondly, the exploration led to the expansion of European trade with West Africa into the hinterland. With the opening up of the Niger, for instance, European merchants began to penetrate into the interior of the Niger district, and this resulted in an expansion of the palm oil trade. In consequence of this, the coastal people lost their lucrative position of middlemen, which they had held for about 4 centuries. Third, the exploration dealt the final death blow on the slave trade. The abolitionists had pointed out that European penetration of the interior of West Africa and the introduction of legitimate trade were the only way to finally kill the slave trade in Africa. 4. From the humanitarian point of view, the exploration prepared the way for the European missionary activities in West Africa. And finally, from the political viewpoint, the explorations were equally important. They prepared the way for European imperialist activities in West Africa, which culminated in the scramble for and partition of West Africa. Next week, we shall treat chapter 9 with the title, The Growth of Legitimate Trade in Nigeria. Thank you.